talk really is just, I suppose, a taster in many respects, because there's a lot more to say about her and her family, which might be another talk in the future. So this talk is really an introduction to Mary, and also about her writings about Uttoxeter. Because without her writings about Uttoxeter, we wouldn't know half of what we know. We all know of, people like Arnold Bennett writing about the potteries in Clayhanger, or Anna of the Five Towns, or similar sort of authors talking about places fictionally, but only half fiction. And what we've discovered, what Joy discovered, and what I've discovered reading the work of Mary Howitt, is actually she was writing about Uttoxeter for years. And you might not know it as Uttoxeter, but those of us that live in the town know exactly it was Uttoxeter. And I'm going to share some of that writing with you about what she got to say. So okay, so let's make a start. Okay, Gordon, here we go. Now this is a very odd slide to start with. When I do it on purpose, I took this in just after lockdown. You're going to say, well, that's not Uttoxeter at all. That's Newstead Abbey. That's Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire. And I knew Newstead Abbey because I used to work for Nottinghamshire County Council, and I used to visit often. But what I didn't see is the gardens, which are just round the corner from the Abbey. And just after the first lockdown, my wife and I went to have a little visit, because my daughter lives in Nottinghamshire. And walking around the gardens, we came to this next part. In the gardens of Newstead Abbey is this wall, and down that wall are people that Newstead Abbey celebrates as great people of literature, particularly great people of literature that came from the Midlands. So here, prominently on the left-hand side, is Lord Byron. And Lord Byron lived at Newstead Abbey. That's why the connection's there. So I'm looking, like you do when you're a tourist and you're out for the first time in months. You're thinking the world is a wonderful place. And there's Lord Byron. And then I walk down this aisle of great people of literature, and I come to this. And that's Mary Howitt. And in this long line of great people of literature, then the city of Nottingham, in I think the late 19th century, certainly the early 20th century, decided that Mary Howitt was one of the great people of Victorian literature. Now think about that. There she is next door to Lord Byron. And then it's Mary Howitt. It's our same Mary Howitt that lived on Ballant Street. And you think, whoa, there's something that we're missing here between the Mary Howitt that we think we know and the Mary Howitt that a lot of people thought was so important that they were put on display. So the research therefore took that line. Who is she really? Who is Mary Howitt, and what did she do that made her be so celebrated a character? And I was going to call it I wasn't going to call it Mary Howitt in Uttoxeter. I was going to call it Mary Howitt Superstar, because it's quite evident that in her time she was an absolute celebrity. She was an absolute megastar. And you think, what? That can't be the same Mary Howitt. Have you got it wrong? Is it the same? And she absolutely was a megastar. Not just as a poet, you'll hear some of her poems in a minute, but as many other things. And I want to just spend a little time just alerting you to some of the fantastic stuff that she actually did. Right, Gordon, carry on. Easy, I've got a little assistant. Here we are. So let's start with Mary herself. There she is, lovely. The likeness is obviously stunning with Patricia. Well, Mary Howitt in in Cinderford. She's not from Uttoxeter. That's the first thing to bear in mind. She was born in the Forest of Dean. Why she's in the Forest, why her family were in the Forest of Dean, is that Samuel Botham, her dad, who was a surveyor, was trying to make a few pounds by investing in an iron ore development in the Forest of Dean. And so the whole family were there, and that's where Mary was born. And she was born in 1799. And originally, when I was going to do this talk, I was going to do it in 2019 to celebrate her birthday. You can see we're quite close to her birthday, not quite, but 12th of March she was born. But unfortunately, the museum wasn't open then because the building wasn't finished, so we couldn't do that. But she died in Rome. She's actually buried in Rome. Now, there aren't many Uttoxeter people that lived in Uttoxeter that are buried in Rome, but Mary is buried in Rome. And she lived in Uttoxeter from about 1801 to 1821, so about 20 years of her life. She actually lived in Uttoxeter. She came here, therefore, as a very young child, very, very young child. And the reason they moved back to Uttoxeter, because the family, the Botham family, were here anyway. They were already in the house on Ballon Street, which you'll see pictures of. And those of you that don't know it, you know, walk down Ballon Street. It's the only one in Uttoxeter that's got a plaque on it. So the Bothams were already resident there, but Samuel was trying to make his fortune, and it went pear-shaped. It absolutely went pear-shaped. It was awful investment, and it's a theme, I think, and Joy will probably back me up later on today. Samuel wasn't the best businessman, Samuel Botham. He just wasn't. He seemed to get involved in all sorts of things that really didn't quite work out. So they had to come back to Uttoxeter, and that's where she grew up and spent 20 years of her life. After she left Uttoxeter, she used to come back a lot. And she also reflected a lot about her life in Uttoxeter. And you can see from her writing that actually a time in Uttoxeter shaped her thoughts and her writing, and her reflections later on in life go back to that time when she was actually in Uttoxeter. So she travelled the world, right, but still remembered Uttoxeter. She went all over the world. She, for example, spent a long time living with her husband in Heidelberg in Germany. They used to live in the summer, they used to live in Heidelberg, and in the winter, they lived in Rome. Bit different to Ballon Street, but that's a sort of person that we're beginning to think about. This is not this little person that was living in Ballon Street, that was a Quaker, and that also, as you'll see later on, formed the way that she viewed the world. Not just that person that lived in Ballon Street, but this is somebody that was seriously well-travelled, very well educated, very informed, and extremely influential. Not just in literary circles, but political circles, and in terms of social reform. And the more that you read things, sometimes I read these things. I was at an exhibition, I was trying to enjoy this the other day. I was at an exhibition in London of great female painters. And there's this curator had done this little blurb, and then I focused in on it, and it talks about Mary Howitt. Not Mary Howitt as a painter, but Mary's daughter, Anne, that we'll mention in a minute. So she's a really important person. Okay, let's move on. So Mary married William Howitt at the Quaker Meeting House across the road. And she talks on the 16th of April, 1821. And she talks, this is her Mary talking now. William and I and her nearest relatives walked to the meeting house, and all the little town of Utah. A lot of the Uttoxeter Quakers didn't celebrate you know, the major events of the year, Christmas or Easter or whatever. That wasn't part of what Quakers were about. But what they were about, and it still are about, is these central planks of what Quakers believe in. And there they are: simplicity, hence the simple dress, peace, the anti-war, integrity. They reckon everybody really should be treated with great integrity, whether rich or poor, and should be part of a community. Nobody should be isolated from anywhere else. They should be all equal, male and female. And they also believe that they have a right of stewardship over the planet, over the environment. You know, and you could sign up to all of those, really, you know, if you think about it. And you can see how those beliefs as a Quaker framed the way that Mary led and developed her life. And William too. Sometimes, I think, probably naively, and I don't mean that in a derogative way for Mary or William Howitt at all, but they assumed that everybody also signed up to those values. And even in today, but in their day, they didn't. And so it led to them getting into situations that perhaps, you know, were a bit naive. But it did form the basis of what they believed in. Okay, next one, Gordon. Thank you very much. You can't get the stuff. There we go. So she's most famous, and we'll start with, she's most famous as an author, as a poet. And everybody thinks, okay, Mary Howitt, and it says on the house, poetess. It says poet. And so she published lots and lots and lots and lots of poems. And they often had wonderful covers. And these are two covers like this. We think that some of the illustrations in the original books were actually done by her daughter, Anne, who was a fantastic artist, was actually, if you know anything about art or you're interested in art, was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite group. Not any art group, the Pre-Raphaelites. So she was taught by Holman Hunt, Ford Madox Brown. She knew what she was doing, and she often therefore illustrated and contributed to what her mum wrote. But her most famous that we all know is The Spider and the Fly. The story is interesting because, like a lot of what Mary Howitt wrote, I mean, she's very Victorian, very moral. There's a message. It's not a playful, you know, little poem. It's something, a lesson to be learned. Don't be tempted. Don't be flattered. Don't go into places where you shouldn't go. And this is a tale to children, and it was meant to be like that. And I think when it was written, it was interpreted like that as well. Not that you know, the normal stuff that we just get the first line. So she did huge numbers of that, and a lot of them have got that moral sort of frame to it. Okay, Gordon, next. What people don't realise is, of course, that many of our stories that we tell our children, our grandchildren, and our relatives, you know, the Little Mermaid, the Tin Shop, all that, actually Hans Christian Andersen, and without Mary Howitt, we wouldn't know them, because in fact, it was Mary Howitt that translated those stories from Danish. And you think, what? How does that work? You know, this is the great stories of all ages that our kids have, and these are translated by Mary Howitt. And originally they were called Wonderful Stories for Children. That's one of the first front pages of the first edition. And you can see it by Hans Christian Andersen and translated from the Danish by Mary Howitt. So Mary Howitt actually spoke Danish, she spoke Swedish, she spoke French, and she spoke German. So this is somebody that grew up in Balance Street in Uttoxeter. This is somebody that without her, we wouldn't know those tales. So it gives you a glimpse of, actually, this is not just the author of The Spider of the Fly. This is somebody quite special. Okay, good, next. So this is what really the Mary Howitt, the more you research, this is what she's about. She wrote about 110 works, not just The Spider and the Fly. There were a lot of them. Nearly as many as a joint author with William. William and Mary were a partnership, a writing partnership. But what's very interesting about Mary, as well as being a poet and a novelist, she was a translator. She was a columnist, a newspaper columnist. She was a magazine journal columnist. She was a nature and a travel writer. We would also add to that she was also what we would now call a literary agent. And without Mary Howitt, some of the greats of 19th century literature would have never made it, because she was the connector between the author and the publisher. She was so feted in her day and so celebrated, certainly in Scandinavia, that in Stockholm in 1879, she was given the silver medal for a contribution to Danish literature. And as a result of that, she got a pension from the Danish government. And that's a lot of money. You know, £100 a year was a lot of money. But a network, she's a networker. The list could be huge. She knew Charles Dickens, Lord Tennyson, Elizabeth Gaskell, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, William Wordsworth. She knew politicians. She knew William Morris. She knew everybody. And she often, therefore, tended to mix, the couple mixed, particularly with those that were campaigners, that were social reformers. And now that, you can see this Quakerism at the back here. You know, everybody is equal. Everybody should be treated with integrity. Everybody's part of this community. She was a campaigner for women's rights before the suffragettes had even started. She was anti-slavery. She was a supporter to the poor. She was anti-capital punishment. And many of the campaigns of the time in the mid 19th century, somewhere in the middle of them is Mary Howitt. She might not be the leader of them, but she's the person that's making the connections, bringing people together. And the greatest thing that she and her husband did is she was a great supporter of women writers. Now, this is a time, obviously, you know, where a female writer was not regarded. I mean, many of them, when they wrote, of course, put a male name on it, and was not at all celebrated. But Mary and William, and it's again because of their Quakerism, I think, because the role of women within the Quaker belief was much, much, much stronger than it was in the rest of Victorian society. There were women Quaker preachers long before, you know, the Church of England got its act together and allowed, you know, people into the Church of England, and they were great supporters. Anybody that was beginning to find their way as a woman, as a writer, the Howitts had got something to do with. They were the promoters, they were connectors, they were the people that were putting them in contact with others. Next, Gordon, thanks. And it was particularly at a time of attitudes that were against. These are two quotes that I picked up. I thought they were lovely. This is John Ruskin on the first one. Women are physiologically, I've got it right in a minute, different to men. And if women are taught Latin and Greek, valuable brain space might be used that could be honed to sewing and homemaking skills. John Ruskin is a seriously important part of Victorian society. Very powerful character, writer, critic, philosopher, you know, very, very important. They had those views, right? And he also knew Mary Howitt. You can see how that went. But it didn't help that Queen Victoria, you know, the Queen, had also, you know, this mad folly of women's rights. But God created men and women different. Let them remain each in their own position. That's not great, is it? From the Queen. So Mary was fighting, you know, that battle, but they fought it, and she fought it well. Okay, next one, Gordon. Thanks. One of the ways that the Howitts push their cause and push their interests is through they had their own journal. Journals in Victorian times are a mix of what we call magazines, really. Howitt's journal, which didn't last a long time, which was edited by William and Mary, and often was illustrated like this one by their daughter. This is a sort of Christmassy coming down the chimney thing. They used it as a platform for their views, and they used it to therefore get other literature in that wouldn't normally be celebrated at the time. So it's really interesting, and the more you look at them, the more interesting they become. All right, go next one. This gives you a flavour of what so it's a cross between Home and Gardens, equivalent, Good Housekeeping, The Economist, the National Geographic, you name it, it's in there. And you can see, so work from and I'm going to pick up a few. So you've got stuff about banking for the poor. You've got Thomas Berwick, the reviver of wood engraving, the cultivation of the blackberry, the bread finder, don't know what that's about, the Bristol Raggy School. So you know, this idea of the great supporter of that. This one about a man who lived in the wilderness who had a child for his neighbour. Story by Mary Howitt. This is interesting. The Red Shoes. It's written by this funny guy called H.C. Anderson, but it was translated by a daughter. So Anna also spoke Danish. So there, for the first time, is that story published in Howitt's journal in 1847. The first time we see it. But I want just to spend 1 minute on this top one. This is Mary. This sums up what Mary's about. It's addressed to the women of Great Britain and Ireland. It's a petition on behalf of Mary Ann Hunt by Mary Howitt. Now, this was a big issue of the day of 1847. And Mary was incensed, as were other social reformers. Very quickly, Mary Ann Hunt had murdered a landlady. Okay, she was very poor. Landlady was demanding greater rent, lost it, killed her, admitted it, not a problem. Sentenced to death. However, she's pregnant. And the big moral issues of the day were, when should we execute her? Now, the judge decided that she should be executed after she'd given birth. So give birth, then that's it, she's hung. So there's this all sorts of moral issues going on here. One, Mary's incensed, you know, she didn't believe in capital punishment anyway. She's got all these issues about this woman's really poor. What was she driven to get that far? What is the right? So there's all sorts of moral issues going on here. And Mary uses the Howitt's journal, and she writes to all sorts of newspapers. The Times refused to publish the letter because of it's from a woman, and this is a murderer, so that's it. And she pushes it so hard that she writes to Queen Victoria, who, after several months, gave her pardon. So Mary Ann Hunt wasn't hung. She had a baby. She had a baby in prison, but when it was 2 years old, they were transported to Australia. She was incensed by it, but she saved her. But it sort of summarises really what Mary was about. You know, she was a real campaigner, and she put her name on it. She put her head above the parapet, you know, very much a male parapet here. She's putting her head above it. She's saying, I'm not having it. I'm telling you, this is wrong. And very strong character. And it's illustrated in Howard's journal. Okay, next, Gordon. Okay, so let's have a look at Mary now reflecting on Uttoxeter. So all that background, all that incredible work that she does nationally and internationally, she writes a number of books, and the centre and the subject for a number of books is actually Uttoxeter. Now, these are some of them. These are modern versions. So this is her autobiography, my own story, or the autobiography of a child. This is her reflecting on her childhood, particularly her first 20 years in Uttoxeter. This one here is fiction, but actually it's not, because the more that you read it, as you will see in a minute, then what we're talking about is Uttoxeter. And this one, over the right-hand side, the childhood of Mary Leeson, just take out Leeson and put Howitt, is actually, it's a story of this girl growing up in a market town in Staffordshire, near the River Dove. I can fill in more details, but it actually is about Uttoxeter. And when you read them, you learn a lot about Uttoxeter of the day in the time of Mary Howitt. Okay, so this one, you can buy this, by the way, if you really want to, 500 pages worth of Wood Leighton. I bought this. It's not the greatest read, I have to say that. It is very Victorian. She's a very Victorian. So to celebrate her as a poet and an author is probably only part of the story. But it's based on this town called Wood Leighton. And this is her description of Wood Leighton. With its clustered buildings and lofty spire, just where a fine valley opens into one finer. And she's actually describing that, and that is Uttoxeter. Now, that's not part of the book. That's it's contemporary. This is a view, by the way, from coming, if you're coming into town from Marchington, there's obviously the church over here. This building in the foreground, right in the foreground there, is the actual original Lane's Grammar School that was on School Lane, which is now Bridge Street. So that's what she's talking about. So Wood Leighton, in fact, when you look at Wood Leighton, you think, I've been there. You know, it's her version of being, you know, the Arnold Bennett version of Stoke and the Potteries, but she's talking about Uttoxeter. Okay, thanks, Gordon. And she starts talking about this house, a house of great comfort that was old-fashioned, with low rooms and small windows. And she's talking about that house there, and that's the house that has the plaque on it in Balance Street. It had actually been in the family a long time. The house and most of the houses at that end of the street, those of you that have been on the houses tour with me, we know that most of that part of the street is 18th century, early 18th century. Most of it was built after the Great Fire of Uttoxeter that swept that part of the town. So this is early 1700s. The fire was in the 1680s. Yeah, started in the marketplace, about where Sergeant's Butchers is, and then swept down Balance Street. And the reason why Balance Street is so wide, it wasn't wide originally, it was quite narrow, but it was cleared after the fire, and it went straight down Balance Street and wiped out most of that part of town. So these brick houses, the grand brick houses that you see on Balance Street, are part of that rebuild. And the Botham's house, that was originally through the family line of the Shipleys, is one of them. And that's where she lived, and she describes it. And that's her description of it. She actually describes every single room, which is also fascinating. I was going to knock the door of the people that lived there. And I thought, oh, you know, this is your house. You know, she describes your house. Okay, next, Gordon. But she also talks about her dad and her parents, who were very strict. Certainly Samuel, well, they were both very strict Quakers. And then she obviously was a lonely child. You know, though she had a sister, she was a very lonely child. And her dad, this is what she says of her dad: busy man, very silent, uncommunicative. You know, it's reverence and trust. And a mum was great influenced by a father, but loyal in his affection. So there's this sort of image of this quite dour sort of chap who nevertheless you love dearly. What she also talks about is some interesting insights into what her dad was doing. Two things. One, he was a surveyor for the Needwood Forest, for the Duchy of Lancaster estate. So when the Needwood Forest was being enclosed, so most of what we see of the Needwood Forest now is a managed version of what the forest used to look like. The surveyor that was used to help them plan it was Samuel Botham, her dad. But what he also was involved in is this, unless, like me, you come from Leicester, you won't ever know what that is. That's New Walk. New Walk in Leicester is an amazing, long Victorian grand walk from the centre of town out towards a place called Victoria Park. It was very grand, and he was the surveyor. But she obviously missed him. She absolutely missed him dearly, and poems are not stories are not only about the place, Uttoxeter, but also about the family. Like this poem.
Father is coming. The clock is on the stroke of 6. The father's work is done. Sweep up the hearth and mend the fire and put the kettle on. The wild night wind is blowing cold. 'Tis dreary crossing o'er the wold. He is crossing o'er the wold apace. He is stronger than the storm. He does not feel cold, not he, his heart, it is so warm. For father's heart is stout and true as ever human bosom knew. He makes all toil, all hardship light. Would all men were the same? So ready to be pleased, so kind, so very slow to blame. Folks need not be unkind or skeer, for love hath readier than fear. Nay, do not close the shutters, child, for far along the lane the window looks, and he can see it shining plain. I've heard him say he loves to mark the cheerful lighting through the dark. And we'll all do what father likes. His wishes are so few. Would they were more, that every hour some wish of his I knew. I'm sure it makes a happy day when I can please him anyway. I know he's coming by this sign. That babe is almost wild. See how he laughs and crows and stares. Heaven bless the merry child. He's father's self in face and limb, and father's heart is strong in him. Hark, hark! I hear the footsteps now. He's through the garden gate. Run, run, little Bess, and open the door, and do not let him wait. Shout, baby, shout, and clap thy hands. For father on the threshold stands.
Thanks, Tricia. Dad was obviously away a lot. He worked incredibly hard, and he also had this naiveness. It was described when he died as a prosperous surveyor. The more I've researched in it, he was anything but prosperous. He got himself in all sorts of situations, business transactions, where actually he thought everybody played the game fairly like he would. He was greatly respected in the town, but he was also people, I suppose, took the mickey out of him and also got him into deals where he lost out. And interesting, he worked so hard, and he did work so hard that only 2 years after Mary married, he died. Probably through exhaustion. And the more you look at it, you then think, okay, his obituary said he was very prosperous, but then Mary's mum has to move out of Balance Street because she can't afford it. So he's not leaving an awful lot left. The other thing I've found that there's a house right at the end of Balance Street. I should have put a picture up. House right at the end of Balance Street, right in front of you there. It's a tall three-story house, very old house. And people that used to still own it, let me have a look at the deeds. And it was owned by Samuel Botham for a while. And that's, you know, one of his several properties in town. But it was quite clear that actually he borrowed money from 9 separate people in order to buy it. So when he died, poor Mrs. Botham got nothing. So, you know, he was a very hard-working chap, and she missed him incredibly. But in fact, it didn't quite go his way. Okay, good. Let's have a look at the next one. The other thing that she really loved, however, when her father was home, and her grandfather as well, that lived with them for a while, then he moved out to a cottage on the heath, was walking. And they used to walk. One of their favourite walks was this one. So this is an Ordnance Survey map that is after, slightly after Mary Howitt, because there's a railway line there. So there's basically, that's where the house is. There's Balance Street. We're sat there at the moment. Sawmill was out there, was there. Okay, so they used to walk this way across this field south. What's interesting, if you follow this very old map, you will also see, first of all, they were walking to Samuel Botham's flax fields. So the area over here was covered in flax. Well, that's interesting in itself, you know. But also, if you look very carefully, there's a house there, and it's called Wood Leighton, and that's where the book name comes. So they used to walk down here to Leighton Cottage, and then back in what is Wood Lane, all the way back into town. And it was a favourite walk for them. And what Samuel and her granddad did is teach them an awful lot about the environment. It was all part of their Quaker stewardship of the environment. But like a granddad was a herbalist, and through the walks of her granddad and with her dad, she knew loads and loads and loads about the natural environment. Amazing amount of stuff about the natural environment. And it was through those walks that she accumulated that knowledge. And then she then built them back into her poems and into her books at the same time. Yeah, that's exactly where it is. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same house, I think. I haven't been to that house for ages. But that was the walk that they used to do. The other favourite walk that they would do is the opposite direction. I haven't got the map to show you, would be that way into Bramshaw. Into what their walk was called, into walking to Bramshaw Woods. That in itself is interesting. Walking to Bramshaw Woods. Now, if you walk in that direction from Balance Street now to Bramshaw, you don't come across many woods, right? So just getting an idea of what they were doing and when they were doing it and what the town was like at that time is a fascinating insight that's not written anywhere else. You can't find it. We haven't got any thousands of records upstairs. We haven't got that stuff recorded. It's recorded in the books. Okay, good, thank you. This is a description, This is a description of Wood Leighton. And it didn't take a genius to work out that this actually is Uttoxeter marketplace. Shapeless sort of marketplace. There it is. Smarter shops are there. But there's a modern brick edifice, square and formal, with a door in its centre and 4 sash windows. That's my photograph that I took this week, right? And the front door originally, where the horse and dove is, was there. It's a bit ironic. Yeah, a bit ironic. But it also shows, and it's actually true, that those of that have been with me looking at buildings in Uttoxeter, this seems to stand out like a sore thumb. It's a very, very imposing brick building. And it was clear when she was writing this that it was fairly new, that had been slammed on to these buildings, almost slammed on. You can see this huge, great edifice there. And all these are timber framed, really, that are brick fronted. So there's her objecting to the fact that there's we object to new builds, what an mess this is. And there's Mary Howitt saying, actually, this is a mess. When we look at it, well, this must be a really old building. There's her saying, actually, this is a mess. It doesn't fit. Unpleasant contrast. They're ancient and respectable neighbours, which is lovely to think that, you're talking about something that we think is all part of the same block, but obviously wasn't. Okay, next, good. And this is also a reflection. This is coming from Mary Leeson, the child of Mary Leeson. And it gives us an idea of this enormous influx of people into the town for the town fairs. This spacious market covered in large umbrellas, and this is obviously an older photograph. This is early 1900s photograph of the marketplace. But if you look at the photograph and look at the description, you can see covered stalls or even large umbrellas. And beside the once-a-week market, we can wish, can't we? There was in October a great annual fair of great importance. Shopkeepers opened large booths to display their wares: cutlets from Sheffield, lacemen from Nottingham, hosiers from Derby and Leicester, woolens from Yorkshire, pottery from Staffordshire, and toymen from Tunbridge Wells. But it gives you a sense of how important these annual fairs were for the town. Thousands and thousands of people came to town and stayed 3 or 4 days. The effect on the economy of their town was enormous. And she's talking about that as somebody that's experienced that huge volume of people coming into town from far and wide, from absolutely far and wide. And you can see how the traders from all over the place were coming into Uttoxeter because they know they were going to make some money. It's a bit like the old days, many of us are old enough remember the old days of the market, even the retail market. People coming from all over the place with their stuff because this was a place to sell your stuff. That was the modern day equivalent in the late 90s, the early 2000s. But it was a reflection of this enormous great thing that Mary writes about. And it's very rare that you actually get a description of where those people were coming from to sell their wares. So more research might reveal who was the people that came to Uttoxeter to sell their cutlery and so on and so on. But it's a lovely description. Okay, next, good. The other thing that's nice is this. She talks about the church, but it's not the church that we know. So this is the church of considerable size, and though of a simplest Gothic. You think, well, actually, our church, St Mary's, is not the simplest Gothic. So you think, hold on, something's not matching here. And has a handsome appearance. The churchyard is one of the pleasantest I ever saw, not locked up to the public, and forming an open link to the marketplace. And that's sort of a reflection of a very different St Mary's. St Mary's was the subject of what the Victorians would call restoration. I would probably call it destruction. It was flat, almost flattened. So the Mary's talking about that church, not the church that exists now. And you notice the tower's different, very, very different. The shape's sort of very similar. You'll notice the door, the main door is this side, not the front. Because in the 1830s, when it was greatly altered, lots of it was taken away. I think they reduced it almost down to this very small part of the tower, and the rest was gone, including the churchyard, by the way. If you ever, I'm doing some research, we're doing some research at the moment for a family. We're looking for their relative in the churchyard. You try looking in St Mary's churchyard. It was flattened. You know, it's part of the restoration, absolutely flattened. And then they built the cemetery. Just happened to flattened it. But, you know, all those gravestones were just pushed over. You'll see them just inside as you go towards the churchyard. So it's a very different church that's described very rarely in anywhere else of St Mary's. Okay, Gordon. The other thing is, this is a later great photograph. This is High Street. What are they doing? Putting water in drains. This is her describing the town. The town was wretchedly paved and the streets were full of the most awful projections and irregularities. There were no lamps. Probably you're going to say, this is, you know, 2022. No lamps, and residents were indifferently supplied with water. All of these things in his, Mary's father's mind, the design of improving the benefit of the place. The town was very late. This town was very late in getting good drainage of water. And Mary's father was incensed by this, Samuel, and he came up with massive plans to redevelop the town. He died before they were realised, and what he forgot to do is negotiate his bill. He got paid nothing. And that was a bit, you know, symptomatic of the way that Samuel did business. But you know, she's talking about a place that, you know, had very irregular streets and was a bit of a mess, to be honest. Okay, next one, Gordon. Can you do it? He's done it, yeah. This is interesting, just a couple more. This is interesting. She picks up, she's in the church here, she picks up this, the good people of Woodlayton are loyal. Mr. Ward's hall must be swept for the king's reception. Now, what she's actually talking about is Mr. Wood's house, which is here. Mr. Wood's house is on Dove Bank. It's not there now. Where Tireways is, yep. If you don't know Uttoxeter, apologies. Where Tireways is, the nice Victorian houses next door to Tireways go down Dove Bank. All the way down to the roundabout, that was Mr. Wood's house. That was Mr. Wood's garden. All the way down, not just that, all the way down to what is now the main road in front of Tesco, that's Mr. Wood's house, right? Mr. Wood was about the richest person in 17th century Uttoxeter, and he lived probably in a house a bit like that. We don't know quite what it was like, but it was the biggest house in Uttoxeter. It was demolished in the 1800s, and I didn't know it was demolished in the 1800s until Mary says in her books, and my dad went to get some of the wood panelling from the old hall as it was being demolished, and he put it into our house. Whether it's still there, don't know, but that's what he did. But what's more interesting about it, okay, Gordon, next, is what she says about this. And some of them that have been out on the streets with me will hear me talk about this. Mr. Wood's house here became the centre of the Uttoxeter jewellery industry, because it was bought by a family called the Copestakes, and the Copestakes are still around the town. I think the name's still around the town. And what the Copestakes did is to take the old hall and these outbuildings here that you can see on the 1658 map and turn them into workshops. And they employed 150 people. This is the early 18th century, late 1700s, early 1800s. 150 people making jewellery, fine stones, set in silver. And the reason I put that shot on the right-hand side, apologies, I pinched it from Staffordshire Past Track, that is Foal Mill, down the hill from where I live. Foal. If you go, Foal, yeah, if you go, you know, Uttoxeter thing. Foal Mill, the wreck that used to be the dairy, right, was, for part of its life, a jewellery mill. And Mr. Copestake redeveloped the mill long before it became a dairy, and his fine stones, he used to shine in the mill and then bring them to the manufactory here in Uttoxeter on Dub Bank. And you'll notice on the old map, it was Bradley Lane. But the end of Bradley Lane is now called Silver Street. And that's why it's called Silver Street. Because it used to be the jewellery quarter of Uttoxeter. And the Cope Stakes, Mary talks about the Cope Stakes and their jewellery industry. And nobody else, you never see it anywhere else. And it's only because of what she talks about that we know anything about it. The Cope Stakes went bust, by the way. They made jewellery for all sorts of people. In Josiah Wedgwood's diaries, Josiah Wedgwood comes to Uttoxeter to buy jewellery. Wow. Why? What is that? The Cope Stakes also made gifts for diplomats to take to Europe, made in Uttoxeter. Wow. And that's the first time that we know anything about it. It went bust. It went bust mainly because they were doing dodgy stones. Trying to cut costs. Somebody found out, they went bust. Reputation went down. So poor old Miss Grace Cope Stake unfortunately got the butt end of the fact that her dad made a real mess of it. But it was really big business at one time, and she talks about it in a book. And by the way, if you're ever in that area, just there, that bit there on the mill, it will say H.C. Henry Cope Stake. Then became the dairy and all sorts of things. Now a wreck. Okay, next, good, thank you. The other really interesting thing she talks about is bull baiting in the marketplace. And this is a description of the bull baiting. Now, those of us that know the area, marketplace, the area where the War Memorial is Bear Hill. Some people think it should be spelled B-E-A-R, bear, as in big grizzly thing. Because we think it was also, before bull baiting, it was a bear baiting area. But this was big sport in Uttoxeter. Bull baiting in the marketplace, a bull brought up from the town meadows, down where Tesco's now is, trailed into the town, paraded around the town for, it's a bit like a Spanish bullfight in some respect. Yeah, same idea, dressed up, the bull's dressed up, taken around the town on the chain, chained up, then they set the dogs on it. And this goes on for 3 days. Sometimes the bull is so distressed, apparently, according to Mary, that it gets out of its chains and runs right up the high street. Can you imagine? A very angry bull on its way through the high street? Not good, but it does take place. And then after all of this, things shot. And this goes on until the mid-19th century in Uttoxeter, and it's described in Mary Howitt's day. I mean, she's horrified by it, but it takes place in Uttoxeter. And you don't see it recorded anywhere else. It's amazing. Okay, good. And finally, she talks about a whole range of other houses. And this one I thought was interesting. There's lots of them, but this is a low brick mansion, stood half buried in trees with an ancient wall over and about, which ivy grew in heavy masses. This is Admiral Gardner's house on the High Street, next to the library. But you can see there's some of the ivy, but it used to be, obviously in the 1800s, was covered in ivy and had a huge wall that stretched all the way down past the old cinema, now the church, all the way down to, I think, Indian restaurant in the corner now, all the way down to there, and its garden came all the way back into town. So it's an enormous place. And she talks about it, and she talks about several other buildings as well. Okay, Gordon. So she dies in the late 1800s, in 1888. And what's sad about it is that after she dies, her name disappears. So how is it celebrated anywhere? Now, this is somebody really, not only important for the history of the town, but in terms of the history of what has gone on in literature and social reform and whatever. Well, we celebrate it because we've got a plaque above this nice house where she used to live. In Nottinghamshire, they actually named a school after her. Howitt Primary School. There used to be two schools, they're merged now. One was called William Howitt First School. The other one was called Mary Howitt Junior School. Now they've one. So they remembered her in Nottingham, even though she spent less time in Nottingham than she did in Uttoxeter.
The old Howitt house in Hanbury?
No, just coincident. I think the name then was often used, but there's no association with the family at all. So she disappears, and it was sad that next one, Gordon, last one, and this is her view right at the end of her life, which is quite sad in many respects. My writers are a bygone age, and no one cares for them now. There are so many better writers since my time. And that was her at the end of her life. And that's probably true, you know, because there are better writers than Mary Howitt. But actually, she was very, very important. And it's sad in many respects that this town and the area generally don't celebrate her more than we do. And the more, but it needs more work. And thanks to Joy's done a lot of it. But I picked it up, and actually there's a lot to talk about Mary Howitt, not just in Uttoxeter. She gives us a massive amount of information on the local history of the town, but actually she's a very, very important Victorian that's now long forgotten. And the only thing that we've got in town is a plaque on the house, and one of those new blocks of flats is called Howitt Place now as well, isn't it? Howitt Crescent, thank you. And that's it. We don't celebrate her.